Hi, I'm Izzy, and this is Dizzy Quilts and Sews. It is finally time to assemble our sampler quilt. Okay, so here's my pile of blocks. I've got all 9 here. And the first thing we need to do is square them up to the same size. So if all of your blocks are 12.5 inches, fabulous. We are going to square them all to 12.5 inches. But if your piecing was a little bit off, or if your quilting sort of distorted your blocks and you'll need to make them smaller, that's okay, as long as you make them all the same size. So if, let's say, one of them is 12 inches, then cut them all at 12 inches square. They all need to be the same size. All right, now to do that, we are going to need rulers. All right, we're going to need rulers. Now you have 2 options. If you have one, use a square 12.5 inch ruler like this one. This one is perfect because I can basically just put it on top of my block and then trim all around, and I've got my 12.5 inch square. If you don't have one of these, you can use a quilting ruler. It'll just take a little bit more time, but it's entirely doable. So let's move these blocks aside for now. I'm going to show you how to use both rulers to square up your blocks. So let's put them aside. All right, so let's start with the first one, which is this gorgeous block here. I think that's the double T block. All right, so I'm going to try and center my ruler on top of the block. And if you see that there's going to be a little bit of batting, so if your block is not exactly 12.5, but maybe a tiny bit smaller, as long as you've got at least 1/4 of an inch clearance, you should be fine. So I can see here, and I don't know how well you're going to see this on the camera, but I can see that my ruler extends a little bit past the block up here and a little bit down here as well, but it's all within my 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I think I'll be fine. Alternatively, like I was saying before, you can just square them all to the same size. So I could decide to go, 12.25 inch instead, and just basically align my ruler so that I have 12.25 inch blocks instead. So I'm going to do this first one at 12.5 and hope that turns out all good. So I'm going to cut on this side, then cut up above. Oh my goodness. There we go. And now I am not going to do the other sides because that would risk me getting injured. So I'm just going to take my block, flip it around, and now align my ruler to the 2 sides I just cut. And cut the remaining sides. There we go. All right, so now I've got a perfectly square 12.5 inch block. So that's how you can do it with a 12.5 square ruler. Now let's take another block. And here's our beautiful 9 patch. And I'm going to use the quilting ruler this time to square this guy up. What I'm going to do is start with cutting or squaring up one side. And to do that, I'm going to align my 4-inch mark on the ruler on this seam right here. So once I'm pretty happy, my block got distorted with the quilting a little bit, but that's okay. If I do that, it might end up a little bit small. So why don't I align to the 4¼ inch line? There we go. And cut one side. Then you're gonna turn your block by 90 degrees and then align the bottom edge of your block with a line on your ruler to make sure that you've got 90-degree angles on the sides. All right, so I'm good here. Cut this side and then just keep going around. Now, one thing I'm gonna do now that I've got 2 sides cut is I'm gonna place my block on the grid on my mat and make sure that I'm gonna get to at least 12½. And it looks like I'm gonna be short a tiny bit on this one. So what I might do is just cut all of my blocks to 12¼ instead of 12½. So if I cut this one to 12¼ I'm gonna land right here, which is great. All right, and don't forget to line up a line with the bottom of your block to make sure you've got your 90-degree angle. Now I'm cutting this one to 12¼ so I'm going to have to go back to the first one I squared up and take a 1/4 inch off. All right, hold on. I need to make sure I'm at 12¼ this way as well. All right. And there we go. I can see a little bit of batting over here, but that's fine. I'm lining up. And there we go. So you can probably see that you can see a little bit of my batting here, some up here, a little bit there, but it's all within my 1/4 inch seam allowance. So that's fine. Do not worry about that. So there's my 9 patch at 12¼ and now I'm just going to use my ruler, my square ruler, and cut all of them down to 12¼ inch. And then we can start with the assembly. All right, so here's my neat little pile of 12¼ inch blocks, all prepared and ready to assemble. Now, you'll need to choose your sashing fabric because we're going to use sashing strips to assemble these blocks. So you're going to need to choose a fabric for the top, so what we're going to see on the top of your quilt, and then a fabric that's going to go on the back of your quilt. So what I've decided to do is basically use the remaining fabric from my back for the strips that are going to go on the back of the blocks, and use my gray neutral for the strips that are going to go on the front of my quilt. Now, choosing 2 different fabrics might actually be a really good idea because it's going to be very, very simple to figure out what to sew to which side of your blocks when we start assembling. So if you have the ability to do that, definitely pick a fabric that's going to match the back of your quilt and a different one for the front of your quilt. I'm going to put all of the cutting instructions down in the description of this video like I always do, but you really don't need a lot of fabric for your strips. So let me get my notes. So basically what you're going to need are 6 strips of 1 inch by 13 for your back, as well as 2 strips 1 inch by 40 inches. So really not a lot of fabric. And then for the front, so in this case, my gray fabric, I'm going to need 6 strips that are 1.5 inches by 13 inches. And then 2 strips that's 1.5 by 40. So really not a lot of fabric. So go ahead and get your strips cut. And and while you're at it, these strips that are 1.5 inch wide, so the strips from your front sashing or front fabric, press them in half so that they're basically 3/4 inch wide when you're done. So I'm going to go and do that, cut all my fabric, press my gray fabric in half, and then I'll come back to you and we're going to start assembling our blocks. All right, so here we go. I've got my 40-inch strip in my front fabric folded in half so that it's now at 3/4 of an inch. And then my 6 strips in the same fabric at 13 inches, also folded in half. I've got my backing fabric at 40 inches and all 6 of my backing strips cut at 1 inch wide, and these are not folded and pressed in half. Now to assemble the blocks, which is what we're going to do next, I highly recommend you use a walking foot. So this is what the foot looks like. We used this early on in our quilt along to quilt our first couple of blocks. So hopefully you've got one of these. You're going to be stitching through a lot of thicknesses when assembling these blocks. So a walking foot is going to come in handy. Also, because some of these seams, or most of these seams, are going to be pretty thick, I highly recommend you use these Wonder Clips to hold everything together. If you don't have any of these, you can use binder clips, you can use hair clips even, but unless you've got some really strong pins, and even if you do, I mean, pins put through this much thickness is probably going to distort everything. So I would not recommend pins, but as a last resort, if that's all you have, then go with that. But if you've got any of these Wonder Clips, they are great for this job. All right, so now I'm going to get myself organized at the sewing machine, put my walking foot on my machine, and then we're going to go over there and start assembling. Oh, but before we do, here's one thing you need to do. Arrange your blocks in a layout that you like, keeping in mind any directional fabric. So this beautiful cactus print here is directional, so I know I need this block to point this way. So organize them in a nice layout on the floor, on a bed, on a table. Take a picture of your layout and then keep that picture in case you forget which block goes where. And then you can come back to your sewing machine with your neat little pile ready to assemble. All right, so I am at the machine. Hopefully the lighting is okay. Oh boy. All right. I've got my blocks over to the right of my machine. I also have the picture of what I want the final layout to be. And I've got my strips all at the ready as well. So you're going to take your first block. In my case, my first block is my 9 patch. You're going to take one short strip of your backing fabric and you're going to put it right sides together on the back. Now, we cut these strips longer on purpose. So you're going to basically center your strip on your block, and then once we're done sewing this seam, we're just going to chop off the extra. And that's just to make sure that if anything gets out of whack, everything's still gonna work fine. Clip it on there. So I'm just gonna use 3 clips. There you go. And then on the front of your block, you're going to align one of your short strips that's been folded in half, raw edges together, again, centering it on your block, and then clipping it. So basically what you're gonna do is move your clips so that you get all 3 layers together. All right, and when I say 3 layers, I have my strip of sashing folded in half, raw edges aligned to the raw edges of my block. I've got my block, and then I've got my backing sashing over here, right sides of the sashing to the right sides of my block, or to the back of my block. Anyhow, you know what I mean. I've got my walking foot on my machine. My stitch length is just a regular 2.5. Now these got out of whack, so it's really important that you align your strips, raw edges all together. And we're gonna sew this as at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. And when I say scant, I mean 1 thread's width inside a 1/4 inch. So my walking foot has exactly a 1/4 inch. So if I align the raw edges to the edge of my walking foot, I get exactly a 1/4 inch. So I want just a smidge inside the 1/4 inch. And then I'm gonna sew all of these together. Now go slow. There's no need to rush through this. You want to make sure that your raw edges stay together. There we go. So here's our first seam. So I've got my front sashing, I've got my block, and on the back, this is what it looks like. All right. So now go to your pressing station and press the back only, so the back sashing, away from your block. Like this. I'm just gonna finger press mine, but I highly recommend that you just go to your iron and press this down really, really well. All right, and then once you're done that, we are going to take block number 2. So block number 2 for me is my cute cactus block, and you're going to put it the backing of your second block against your backing sashing. So again, right sides together. Hope that makes sense. So I've got my block number 1 here, backing up, and my sashing strip pressed away. And I'm gonna put my block number 2's back, right sides together with the sashing strip. So at this point, all I want to sew is block number 2 to the sashing strip. I need to make sure that my sashing on the front here is still away from the backing sashing. Now the only thing to worry about at this point, and again use your clips, is make sure your 2 blocks on the side here are aligned. Okay, so just double check to make sure that everything is aligned properly. So the raw edge of your block aligned with the raw edge of your backing, your sashing here, and then the sides, your blocks are aligned here. And you're gonna sew this again at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Make sure your raw edges are aligned. This is getting pretty thick now, so go slow. All right. So here's the back. So now if I open this, you'll see on the back that we have nice clean edges like this. And you've assembled your first 2 blocks on the back. Now you can go over to your pressing station and give this a nice press. And while you're there, and I'm actually going to do this because that's an important step, on the front of your block, you want to press your sashing strip so that it covers your seam. It's barely going to cover it if you really went with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, but try and press it so that it covers your stitching from your previous step. All right, so I'm going to go at my pressing station and press this one over, and then we're going to show you what we're going to do next. All right, so I've got my sashing pressed over, and I can see here, maybe, wonder if I can get close enough. I can see, hold on, that my sashing strip, when it's folded over here, is not going to completely go over my seam here. And that's because on the block, I took a seam allowance that was probably just a 1/4 inch instead of a scant 1/4 inch. So my stitching line's going to show. I don't really care, but if that's going to bother you, make sure that when you're piecing your blocks together with the sashing, that you really and truly use a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now what we're going to do at the machine here is stitch this down, and I'm not going to clip or pin. I'm just going to use my fingers here to move the sashing over and then stitch it down with a super small seam allowance here. I'm going to try to stitch as close as I can to the folded edge of my sashing. Now you might want to back stitch on this one just to make sure everything is nice and secure. And I'm going to go really slow here, pressing the sashing over with my fingers. So this hand here is pushing my sashing over, and I'm going really, really slow. Now, obviously, and you're going to see that when I'm done with this seam, this stitching is going to show on the front and the back. So the thread I'm using is a pale gray that matches the front sashing almost perfectly, and it's going to match the back well enough. So that's not going to bother me at all that the stitching is going to show on the back. But like if I had red sashing, for example, I don't know that I would go with like white thread to do this. So I would like all of my stitching, all of my quilting is in a gray thread. So I'm trying to match everything as closely as I can. Alright, here we go. Not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but my two blocks are now stitched together. And on the back, this is what it looks like. So you can definitely see the stitching on the sashing, but because it's pale gray, it's not jumping out at you, and it's definitely not jarring. So we've assembled blocks 1 and 2 together, and it looks really neat. So we're going to do the exact same thing to attach block number 3. So I'm going to take, once again, a folded 13-inch strip that I'm going to align with the raw edges of my block, and then clip it down. And then take a 13-inch strip of my backing fabric and put it right sides together with the back of my block, and clip the 3 layers together. All right, now I'm going to sew this down with a 1/4-inch seam allowance, or a scant 1/4-inch seam allowance. Make sure your edges stay together. All right, next I'm going to finger press the back sashing away from the block, like this, and then get my block number 3, which in this case, or in my case, is my churn dash block, and I'm going to line the raw edges of my block with the raw edge of the sashing strip, making sure my blocks also align on the sides. Well, hello, bear. Do not knock the camera, baby. What are you doing? Okay, you need to move, my love. Okay, can I push you over there? Thank you. All right. So I've got my block aligned with my sashing in the back. And Bear is now lying down on top of my blocks. All right, now I'm going to sew this down again at a 1/4-inch seam allowance. And go slow. Now make sure your front sashing is out of the way, because you do not want to stitch that down or get that caught. So we've got, oh, look at me. I stitched it the wrong side up, or wrong sides together. So I'm going to be doing some unpicking. See, I blame Bear for this. He distracted me. So I'm just going to unpick this and stitch these properly. Be right back. All right, so I have now fixed it. So this is the back of blocks 2 and 3 with the sashing strip over here. I don't know if you can hear this, but Bear is lying down right next to me here, and he is purring so loud. All right, and now the front looks like this. So again, we're gonna go over to our iron and press this over really, really well, and then stitch it down. So I'm gonna go and do that and then get back to you when my row is all done. All right, so here we go. We've got our first row all done. So at this point, if you want to, you can trim off the excess sashing between the blocks. So just grab some scissors and cut those off. Okay. There we go. All right. So we're done with row number 1. And you're going to do the exact same thing for all 3 rows. So the first thing is we want to get all of our rows done. And then we're going to take the longer strips I had you cut, so the 40-inch strips, and we're going to basically do the exact same thing with the rows. So we're going to attach the sashing between the rows, we're going to press them, attach the second row, and so on. So exactly the same way, except now instead of dealing with blocks, you're dealing with rows. So go ahead and finish your other 2 rows, and then we are going to attach 2 rows together, and then I'll let you finish the 3rd row, and then we'll have a complete quilt. All right, so I've done my 3 rows, and I'm now ready to assemble them together. So I've got 1 row here, and this is actually row 3. It's the bottom of the quilt, and I'm going to be attaching to this side here, to the top of the row. So just like we did for the blocks. Oh. Actually, you need 2 of these strips. All right, I'm sorry about that. So you'll need 2 of these sashing strips, the longer ones, so the 40-inch ones. Sorry about that. I'll make sure the cutting instructions are actually accurate, but I can still demo how to do this with the 1 strip I have. So we are going to align the raw edges of our front strip, so the one that's folded in half. And again, it's going to be longer than our row, so you can let some of the length go over to the side. That's fine. We'll trim that when we're done. And you'll see I'm still using my clips. All right, so I've got the front sashing all pinned to the front of my row. And now I'm going to do the same thing to the back. So I'm going to flip this over, and I'm going to take my 40-inch strip of backing fabric and clip it to the back. All right, here we go. So I'm going to now stitch this down, all 3 thicknesses at a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, like we've been doing since the beginning. Go slow again and make sure your raw edges are all lined up. Go, 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 go. I'm sorry, Bear is leaning up against you and pushing you away. All right, now I need to get Bear off my quilt. And then just like we did, I'm gonna go and press the backing sashing away from the row and then attach the second row to the back sashing, so backing to backing, right sides together, and then attach it at a quarter inch seam allowance. And then flip the front sashing over, covering our seam line, and then stitching it down just like we did for the blocks. All right, so go ahead and do that to all 3 rows, and then we'll be done. And here we are, all done. All of our blocks are together. All that is left now is the binding and the label, and that will come in my next video in this series. I hope you've enjoyed putting your little quilt together, but if you have any questions at all, please leave them in the comments boxes below and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you so much for watching. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks again, and I will see you soon.